message, Deb, before you do that?
Yes.
Here's the way we're going to try and capture your questions. Put them in the chat. The chat is the little thing that looks like, a note, and put your questions in there, and I will send the questions to Deb or raise the questions with Deb, okay? So any questions you have or notes, you put it right in there in the chat. Thanks, Deb. It's all yours again.
Great.
Can I say something? All I get is myself on screen. I don't see Deborah. I only have me on screen.
Yes. Who is that?
This is Ann Betty Weinschenker.
So you need to look at the options for the screen options you have.
In the lower right, there's 3 dots. And a white bar. Click that.
Okay.
Then click Change Layout.
Change layout, yeah.
And then select Tiled.
Tiled. Okay.
And now you should see everybody.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem.
So,
thank you.
Can I ask a question? Can everybody see the document that I brought up on my screen? It says that I'm presenting to everyone. It should say Yiddish for Turbulent Times. Does everybody see that or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Excellent. Because I can only tell what's on my screen. So that's very good to know.
Good.
The title of this is Lachen mit Yachtstierkes, which means laughing with lizards. I'll tell you what that means in a little bit. Yiddish for turbulent times. And I just kind of collected some bits of Yiddish that I thought might be interesting or useful that show how Jews coped with turbulent times throughout history and how that manifested in the language. So first of all, kind of at the beginning, I have just some ways that you can greet people. There are lots and lots of ways to greet someone in Yiddish, but one that I really like is that you can say to someone, a Leben auf dir, which just basically means a life upon you, live. And it's just like, I don't know, it's a nice way to say hello in a time that is turbulent, chaotic, and difficult. Similarly, if you ask somebody, how are you in Yiddish? One answer that, that many people know is Gott zu danken, thank God, right? Instead of saying, I'm good, I'm bad, I'm great, or in America, we usually just say, oh, I'm great, how are you? How are you? Like, thank God I'm here. I'm alive and healthy, which feels kind of meaningful in this moment. A Yiddish word that probably a lot of people here know is sorus, troubles. But you might not have heard the term gesundheitsorus. Gesundheitsorus are healthy troubles, which are like problems that you shouldn't take too seriously. And again, there's sort of this idea in Yiddish that's kind of imprinted across the whole language that, like, if you're healthy, like, that is the most important thing. And everything else can be crazy and horrible, but your health is sort of the most important thing. So there's troubles, there's real troubles, and then there's gesundheitsorus, healthy troubles, the kinds of problems that they're problems, but they're not as serious as what might be the opposite. Okay. Some features of the Yiddish language that like really deal with these sort of turbulent times. One is that Jews in Eastern Europe often gave their children or renamed children or other relatives with protective names. And the idea of these protective names was that if you gave someone a name like this, it might drive away the evil eye. So for example, if a child was sick and the family feared for the child's life, or often if a family had a lot of miscarriages and then a child was born and they were very anxious about losing that child, they might name the child Alter or Altala, which basically means old one, which is sort of an odd thing to name a baby. But if you're living in a situation where life is very turbulent and not to be taken for granted, it makes a lot of sense that you might name a child old one. And similarly, it was not uncommon for people to add a middle name to somebody's name if they were going through an illness. So to add the name Chaim or Chaya as a middle name to somebody's Hebrew name if they were going through an illness, just to sort of encourage them to continue to live and to add emphasis to that. Okay, so antiphrasis. Antiphrasis is basically, it's a word or a phrase used in a way that's opposite to its literal meaning. And sometimes it can be used for comedy. Sometimes it can be used for irony. In Yiddish, it is basically everywhere throughout the entire language. There are so many examples of things that you say in Yiddish when actually you mean the opposite. And sometimes you say one thing and mean the opposite in order to ward off the evil eye, like calling a baby little old one. Or sometimes you say something that is not what you mean because you want to say something bad to somebody, but you don't actually want that bad thing to happen to them. So here are some examples. One way to say the evil eye is to say a good eye, a gut oig. Because the very mention of evil or the very mention of something bad could feel really sort of dangerous in a situation when things are, really topsy-turvy and not taken for granted. Similarly, demons or, devils in Jewish superstition are very often referred to as die nicht gute, the not good ones, rather than saying that they're evil or bad, like the not good ones. And then another example is people will refer to a cemetery as das gute Ort, the good place, or Beis Chaim, the house of life for the cemetery. So there's these little flips that happen in the language that are almost sort of like protective. Like you can think about them as sort of like building a bubble around the badness or the stress or the sort of evil to make you feel a little more safe, that you're not necessarily naming all the bad things. Another example of this is that in Yiddish, you don't count people. So earlier today, Shirley was saying that we had, 20 some people in this call. And in Yiddish, you would never, ever, ever, ever say that. And there's a long history of Jewish sages and people there's a whole like Talmudic discussion about counting people and how dangerous it is. And I have a Rashi quote in here: counting causes the evil eye to gain power and bring a plague. So like maybe what we all did wrong was we counted too many people.
But it came with the census, Deb.
I'm sorry?
This came with the census.
It came with the census. Oh boy. So maybe Rashi was right. So in Yiddish, if you're going to count people, you don't count people. There are various methods of not counting people in order to count people. For example, instead of pointing to people, if you're counting / not counting, you might point to their feet or point to objects in the room. In Yiddish, you don't count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 students in this class. You count not one, nicht eins, nicht zwei, nicht drei. If you're even counting at all, you're counting there is not 1, not 2, not 3. Oh, there are not 25 people on this call. Or if you're counting like for a minyan where you actually do need to count people, you don't say there are 10 people, or there are 9 people. You say uns fehlt noch eins. We need one more person rather than we have 9 people. So this sort of inversion is sort of another linguistic, like protective mechanism. The idea is that counting, can sort of, there's a superstitious idea that counting can cause sort of evil things to happen, because if you're saying, oh, look, we have 10 people, then what if one gets taken away? And there's this other there's other ideas about Jews being counted, which historically was generally not good for Jewish communities when authorities were coming in and sort of counting numbers of people. There's lots of examples of that going very wrong. So there's this real anxiety about counting people in Yiddish. This next quote here is also about antiphrasis, where it's about saying, not saying what you actually want to say, but everybody knows what you mean. So here's an example from Michael Wex, who wrote this great book called Born to Kvetch. I put the information at the end of this if you want to read it. It's a great book. He says, when my mother found me hanging over the railing of our apartment balcony, she said, "Geh, hang, ves sich dem Karak nicht brachen." Go ahead, hang there. You won't break your neck. A child not weaned on antiphrasis might not have known enough to come down, right? Because if the mom said to the kid, oh, if you hang there, you're going to break your neck, that sort of invites the possibility of that actually happening. So as a protective mechanism, you say, you won't break your neck, but everyone knows, what she's actually saying. Okay. Useful verbs, maybe, hopefully not, for a pandemic. In Yiddish, there's the verb kränken, to get sick. But there's also this really interesting verb, verkränken, which means to use up all of your money on an illness or to go into medical debt. So this is a very old and clearly somewhat familiar concept in Jewish life in Eastern Europe, that this happened to people enough that people, that there's a verb that means that, which, there's no single word in English that means that, even though people have that issue in our country a lot. So I thought it was kind of interesting that exists in Yiddish. Lachen mit Yashtukes, which is the title of this, is to laugh with lizards. And it basically means laughing through your pain, which I think is, there's a lot of ways that you say that in Yiddish. There's also lachen mit Tränen, laughing through tears. But it's somewhat of a constant refrain in Yiddish culture that that one of the best ways through tzoros, through troubled times, is to laugh. So laughing with lizards is kind of, I guess, what the experience feels like when you're laughing, but there's a lot of heaviness in your heart. And then I have, this is not quite a verb, this is more of a phrase. This should have gone in the other section, but I pulled out just some things that, things that might be interesting in a pandemic or in quarantine. There's an expression in Yiddish, if someone is exhausted, you can say, "Du zet ois wie a hon noch tashmish," which means you look exhausted, but it literally means you look like a rooster who's just finished having sex. So Yiddish has some really colorful expressions for exhaustion and stress and being under duress. Okay. This next bit this has a lot of linguistic terms in it, but don't be scared off by them. It's pretty simple, actually. So psycho-ostensive expressions, that's what linguists call it. Basically, those are expressions that they either acknowledge good and give thanks when things are going well, or the opposite. They acknowledge what's bad. They are a constant recurring theme in Yiddish. In Yiddish, you are constantly using these kinds of expressions in almost every sentence. Basically, in Yiddish, you don't say anything that's good or bad without using these expressions. And there's something I think really profound about this, that you don't share any good news or say anything good without either thanking God or saying, "May it be with luck," or "May you have a long life," or "May you be healthy." Anything good that you say kind of has to go within one of those, again, kind of like protective bubbles that is either thanking God or sort of like putting the wish out into the world that good thing is sustained. And then similarly, there's a whole host of ways in which you protect yourself against bad things happening if you have to talk about bad things. As we saw in Yiddish, there's some aversion to talking about bad things because those bad things might happen. But when you do have to talk about bad or really hard things, there's a lot of expressions that you use to sort of protect yourself or other people from those things actually happening or happening to you or happening further. So one that's probably very familiar to everybody is Kenahora, no evil eye, or Kinahera, depending on where your family is from in Eastern Europe. And I think we all probably know how that's used, right? You say something good that you want to happen and you say Kinahera so that the evil eye doesn't prevent it from happening. In Yiddish, if you say something bad that happens to somebody else, if you're talking about something bad happening to somebody else, you very often say "Nicht für euch gedacht." May it like never be mentioned for you. So if I was talking about somebody who was sick or somebody who passed away, or somebody who was like losing their home or something terrible like that, and I was telling my friend or my husband or anybody about it, I would say "Nicht für euch gedacht" in the middle of the sentence. You can't say the bad thing without saying things like that, because in Yiddish and in Yiddish culture, it's just like that is like inviting bad things to happen. There's sort of this sense in Yiddish culture that bad things could happen at any time and good things might not be sustained forever. So you have to, in your speech, like protect all of those things and prevent against the bad things happening, like they're lurking all around you. If if you're talking about something bad, you might say "Cholila," God forbid. or you might say, if you're saying about something you want to do in the future, you can say something like "as men vet leben." So like this sentence that I have: "Morgen as men vet leben, will ich gehen kaufen Hühnerfleisch auf Shabbos." Tomorrow, if I should live, I'll go buy some chicken for Shabbos. Right? So even the simplest things that you're saying, you would never say, "Tomorrow I'm going to go get some chicken for Shabbos." You've got to put something in there to kind of protect that action. Otherwise, there's a sense of like inviting catastrophe. Similarly, anytime you mention a person's age in Yiddish, you say bis 120. You know, may that person live to 120. If I was telling you how old I was or about my birthday, if I didn't say bis 120, it's like grammatically incorrect. Like you have to say it. If someone's telling you about something that they're going through that's really hard, there's a really lovely Yiddish phrase, mir soll sein für dir. If only I could be there or suffer that for you. That's something people say a lot, which I think is very lovely. And we don't have, I think, an easy equivalent in English for when someone's telling us about something hard that they're going through, and we're expressing that feeling of like, I wish I could sort of take that suffering away from you, even if I had to suffer it myself. But I think it's a really beautiful sentiment that can feel very comforting for people. If you're talking about something bad, even if it's theoretical, you can say, "Auf meine Soinim gesucht." It should happen to my enemies. You know, like you could say the coronavirus, "Auf meine Soinim gesucht," blah, blah, blah. And that's another kind of phrase that comes in all the time. And then, another one is halavai, if only. It's if only for things that are also maybe a little unlikely. It's not like you don't say it for things that you think are likely going to happen right away, or but you really hope that they would. So if I said to all of you, ich kann sich nicht erwarten, euch zu sehen in Schule bald. I can't wait to see you all at synagogue soon. The right response would be halavai, like if only, but that's probably not happening soon. Michael Wex has this really great quote about Yiddish. The relationship between Yiddish and fulfillment, Yiddish and any sense of satisfaction, is entirely asymptotic. It might occasionally come within shouting distance, but it never actually gets there, which I think really kind of encapsulates, anytime you're saying something that you want or you wish or you hope for the future, you're always couching it with like, if I should live so long, or, God forbid, or like you're always couching it in something. There's never really an assumption linguistically that anything is for granted or that anything is sure. There's always this sense of like things could dramatically change any minute. Okay, so I have a few more phrases to share with you. We'll skip this one right now. Maybe we'll come back to it. It's a good one, but it requires some explanation. I just pulled out some phrases that I thought might be interesting or valuable for our current moment. Your mileage may vary, but these are just some Yiddish phrases that I know that I thought might be interesting in this particular moment. So I'll read them to you and just tell you a little bit about them. As men wollt sich kennen auskäufen von Teut, wollten die Ormleit gut Parnasse gehabt. If the poor could die for the rich, they'd make a good living. So really poignant one. This one's more familiar probably to some of you. A Mensch tracht und Gott lacht. Man thinks or plans and God laughs. I think that describes March for most of us. This one's very lovely. Wie lang die Augen seinen offen, darf ein Mensch hoffen. As long as your eyes are open, you can still hope. As long as you're alive, as long as you have your life, you can still hope. This is a very common phrase in Yiddish. People say it a lot. Der Oilem is a goylem. It means people are idiots, but it literally means the whole world is a golem. Like the whole public of the whole world is a golem, like a stupid clay monster that doesn't have a brain. Das Land brennt und die Bobbe zwockt sich. The country is on fire and grandma is washing her hair. Interpret that as you will. Das ganze Leben is a milchoma. There's a little typo there, but Leben is a milchoma. All of life is a war. Jeder Mensch hat sich sein Päckl. Everyone has his own burden. And this next one I really love. Men krächzt und man geht weiter. You complain and you keep going, which I think also encapsulates a lot of Yiddish culture as well. There are two more things I wanted to share with you. I know I wanted to keep this not too long, more on the brief side, so that there could be time for questions. But I wanted to share with you a little bit about Yiddish curses. So Yiddish curses are very famous for being like famously elaborate and inventive. And I just pulled a couple just to kind of give you this sense. Eastern European Jews were a people who suffered a lot. And so the action of being angry at somebody and cursing them, people got very creative about it. So one thing to keep in mind is that there's often a lot of humor in these curses, and the ones that I pulled out, I would say, are intended to be both curses and jokes. Except maybe the first one. The first one I think is quite serious. And also that, when, like the example of a mother telling her son, you won't break your neck if you hang off the railing, like people didn't curse at each other unless it was really serious, right? So because there was this sense in the language and culture that that by speaking something, you could make it true. So when people were cursing each other, it was quite a serious kind of a thing, but also tempered with some humor. So the ones that I pulled out, that you can, if you need to curse somebody right now, you'll have these in your back pocket. Some more colorful curses. Zolst brennen on strachovke. There's a lot of curses like these that are clearly about things that people have experienced, but it's also a classic sort of Yiddish curse thing to start with something sort of basic and then make it worse. So you should have a fire and be uninsured, right? Start with something bad and then make it worse. Laufen sollst du im Beisakise jede 3 Minuten oder jede 3 Chadoshim. May you run to the toilet every 3 minutes or every 3 months. Both are pretty awful. Alle 10 sollen dir Reus fallen. This is already pretty bad. May all your teeth fall out. Nur einer soll dir bleiben auf Zonwetig. But one should stay just to give you a toothache. This last one is just quite colorful. Soll ihm wachsen Borikes im Pupik, soll pischen mit Borscht. May beets grow in his belly button, so he'll pee borscht. So those were the things that I brought to share with you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I am happy to talk more about Yiddish and some of these linguistic features a little bit more in depth if anyone is interested. But I think at this point it would be good to maybe open it to questions, because I think that was probably about the time that I was supposed to just talk for.
That was perfect. So, can either, if you raise your hand, I'll get you unmuted, because I don't see people putting questions in the chat. So I see Judy has a question. And can we unmute Judy? Or
yeah,
go ahead.
Unmute herself. And
yeah, I unmuted.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Judy.
So these expressions of curses and kvetches and so forth is extremely colorful, but I'm wondering, do people just come right out and say it without the elaborate invoking of everything that's been horribly done to us? Or is it always couched in this kind of language?
So it's not always couched. It's couched when you want it to be couched. So to put it this way, if somebody is mad at somebody but doesn't actually wish harm to them, then they're going to couch it a lot, right? Like the mother saying to the kid, oh, may your neck not be broken, right? Because there is this sense that if you say something, it might actually come true, right? But if you're really angry at somebody, right? Say you're living in Eastern Europe and you're really angry at the Tsar. There's a whole host of really nasty curses about the Tsar, about the things people wanted to say to the Tsar, because people were very angry, and understandably so. You would not couch that, if you really, but there is a sense that if you're cursing somebody in Yiddish and you're really cursing them, like, and you're not couching it in all these protective phrases, you're really saying something mean.
A little more colorful, the better.
And the more colorful, the better. I mean, I think it's also, there's a sense of humor in it too. And the humor kind of deflects it a little bit and makes it a little less, the meanest curses are the ones with the least humor. The colorful ones are kind of like in between. You know, you're angry and you want to show that you're angry, but you also still have a sense of humor. Yeah. There's a what's the word I'm looking for?
Spectrum?
Spectrum. Yes, there's a spectrum of curses. Yeah.
Thanks, Judy. Who else? Yeah, Marty. Is that Marty? Go, Marty. Unmute yourself. Hit your space bar. That work?
No, you have to click the little microphone button on the bottom of the screen. Click on the screen till the control panel appears underneath your picture, underneath the picture.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A couple of very quick observations. When my sister was ill, and when she recovered, she was giving a name, another name, a middle name, named after a person who lived a very long time.
Yes.
You know, a second observation, I had a Hasidic colleague who had 10 children. And once I said to him, how many grandchildren do you have? And he was really taken quite aback. And he finally, when I pressed him, he said, he wouldn't give me the direct number, but he said between 37 and 39. You know, getting back to what you had indicated earlier. But my final comment is someone in the shul did me a favor recently, a big favor, and I sent her an email saying, not a lebenafti, but a lebenaftein cup. I was always taught that last word by putting in head, Deb, you know, kind of sanctified it.
A lebenaftein cup is very, very common. Absolutely. So a lebenaftein cup would be life upon your head.
Right.
So it's even one step further. And this is the thing in Yiddish is that, like, the more specific you are, the more you mean it. So a lebenaftir, life on you, is less intense than a lebenaftein cup, right? It's just more, the bigger it is and the more involved and elaborate and specific it is, the more meaningful it is. Same with the curses. The worst curses are like 3 sentences long. They're like paragraphs. So, yeah.
So, Deb, speaking of curses, Jason curses to the chat. Jason, you want to unmute and tell us some of these curses?
So I remember having a book of Yiddish curses all translated into English. And there are some really good ones, like may his mouth never close and his tuchus never open. May you become so poor that you have to come to me for money, and I hope I ain't got none to give you. And then my brother was in a sketch where he and another actor were both ladies making their shalach manis baskets, and they were gossiping, and they were saying like, she should live the rest of her days like a chandelier, hanging by day and burning by night.
And that's a really famous one too. That's a really famous curse.
Yeah.
There's also curses that start off sounding like blessings. That's another sort of whole humoristic genre. So there's, you know, one of the famous ones is like, may you have a giant mansion, you know, with 100 rooms, and, you know, in every room, like 1,000 pieces of silver, and it goes on and on and on about all the things you should have. And, you know, in every room, a lovely bed with the covers and pillows and all the, you know, feather pillows and down covers and everything. And may you spend the rest of your days wandering feverish from room to room to room to room in your house. Right? Which is a terrible curse, but it starts off sounding like a really nice thing that you're saying to someone. There's a whole genre of that, which can be really fun.
We have many curses being added. I'm not going to do that. Well, how many, are there some native or original Yiddish speakers in the crowd? Anybody grow up speaking Yiddish? We hear from you, Marty. Yeah. Anybody else? I can't see anybody else.
Jerry. Yeah.
I spoke Yiddish before I spoke English.
How's your Yiddish now, Jerry?
Terrible. Graden Kopf, or
it was my mother's first language, and there was a dentist up the block, and when he was working after my father died, she used to meet him at lunchtime so they could speak Yiddish to one another together.
Whoops, what just happened?
I don't know.
It says that someone's presenting.
Can I
And
present?
you push something?
This is Ann Betty. I'm trying to speak, but I don't know how to do it.
Okay, you are speaking now.
I am. Okay, I can't see anything on the well, I see part of the screen. Yeah, I was going to say this is another example of what we've heard, but a recent one. I have a 13-year-old granddaughter who was born very premature and like 6 months. She was born at 6 months, and her life was in the balance. Her name was supposed to be Tali, and they changed it to Chaya. So her name ever since has been Chaya. But I also going to say, I remember my father using an expression that I thought would belong with the good wishes for things to come, and I didn't see it mentioned. And he used to say something was going to happen in Mirchism.
Oh, and Hashem, yes. I should have put that in here. I can put it in the chat. That's a very, very common Mirz Hashem. Mirz Hashem. And Mirz Hashem is like, yeah, basically anything that you want to happen that you think actually could happen. So there's halavaya, which is, if only, like, I hope it happens, but it's probably not going to happen. Like, I'd like to win the lottery, halavai. But Mirz Hashem is something that you actually think is, could happen or is going to happen, or you expect to happen, but you want to protect it from anything terrible happening to it. Someday my kids will go back to school, Mirz Hashem. Definitely want to that. And someday they will, right? Mirz Hashem. So you, in Yiddish, you would never say anything like that without something protective around it. It would be like a terrible faux pas. Yeah.
Deb, this is Meryl Martin speaking, and all my life, from being a toddler, anytime I was sick, my mother would say "Mir zamfel deal," and I heard it in my ear, and I loved it. And she'd bring me chicken soup and crackers with cream cheese and stuff. So when I had a child, anytime she was sick, I would say the same thing. And now that she's out of the house, I write her the same thing. I have no idea until about a year ago what the words actually were. So I spelled it. Listen to how I spelled it. M-I-E-Z-L-E, Mealsel, Zamfel, Z-A-M-P-H-L, Deal, D-I-E-L.
But that works, right? That's so.
Even though I know what it is.
That's so beautiful. So I'm just gonna write it in here so we can see which one that is. I mean, also spelling in Yiddish, really, it's not there's no real spelling. The only real spelling is in Hebrew characters. So,
Yeah, but I was way off.
That's that one that means like it should happen to me instead of you. And I do think it's so beautiful. It's really beautiful that it stuck in your memory to such a degree, and that it really, and you passed it along. I mean, it's a beautiful thing, and something that we don't always have I don't know that we have quite the words for in English. It's sort of more awkward, and you could say in English, I wish this would happen to me instead of you, but that's a lot. It doesn't flow off the tongue the same way. So
I was glad to see the expression in your list. Are you going to be sending us your PowerPoint?
So it's a PDF, and if you scroll to the top of the chat, you'll see it. Actually, I think I can paste it lower. And then I think John said he's going to put it in Shomrei week as well. So yeah, feel free to use these phrases if they're useful in your life. Yeah.
Thank you.
Who else? Who needs a good phrase for our current COVID state? I see some. Adrian, are you waving? Did you want to
I
say?
am waving because I have a question. I'm sorry I missed part of this because I had a dog emergency, but she's fine now. But my dad used to say when I was a kid all the time, stop hawking a chinik, and
Yep.
all the time. And so all I learned was it was banging my teapot or something like that.
Yep.
And it's like, stop bothering me. But does that mean because that makes a loud noise and that it bothers people? And that's
Yep, that's exactly
Okay.
right. So hawking a
I-
chinik literally means banging a teapot. And it's like that sort of like, especially the older teapots, like they don't just whistle, they make a banging sound, right? Like steam pipes sometimes do. They can make that banging sound. So that's what it's referring to. And hawking a chinik it can either mean to like blabber on uselessly or annoyingly. Stop hawking a chinik. Like to stop hawking a chinik would mean like, basically be quiet, because it's annoying. Yeah. So, but it's also, it's like, again, like so much of Yiddish, it's, there's something humorous about it, right? So it's not like, it's not the same as saying like shut up to somebody, right?
It
Which
was
has
almost
no humor to it. It is, right? It's sort of sweet, right? And it's again, the more specific you are, either the more you mean it or like the more you like somebody. There are other ways to say be quiet in Yiddish, but that's like yeah.
My mother used the term as descriptive. She said, "Oh, she hawked me a chinik."
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that wasn't complimentary.
No.
Not complimentary, but funny, right?
Geraldine, go ahead.
Well, it's not really Yiddish, but when something would never happen, my mother would say it would happen. Well, it is Yiddish. Try to Rosh Chodesh Nisan. There are only the longest any of the days of Rosh Chodesh for 2 days. So it was never going to happen. It was going to happen on the third day.
Right, take no Chodesh Rishon. That Nisan, that's lovely. I should type that in here so people can see it just in case. Cool.
I see somebody raising a hand here.
Oh,
go ahead.
It's dry tug, but the third day.
Oh, the third day. Okay, got it.
Dry tug Rosh Chodesh Nisan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I had a question from Susan. Susan Stahl, unmute yourself.
I'm trying to.
Go, you're gone.
My grandmother used to say, I think this is Yiddish, he used to say God in Himmel a lot. What does that mean?
God in heaven. So Gott in Himmel, God in heaven. And it's kind of like it's like, it can be a lot of things, right? But it's like sort of you're entreating sort of God to like be there with you. Maybe you're really frustrated about something and Gott in Himmel, like, please help me with this. Or maybe you're.
Is that a Yiddish term?
Yes, it is. Yeah, Gott in Himmel, God in heaven.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Carol.
It's not a Yiddish phrase, but my mother would tell the story about when she was dating my father and she met his parents, that they spoke in Yiddish to each other so that my mother didn't know what they were saying. But the irony of the whole thing is my mother's grandmother, my great grandmother, spoke German in the house. So my mother knew exactly what they were saying. So she, so sometimes you got to be careful. Somebody might not know Yiddish, but they might know German.
So Carol, that reminds me of a story that I have to share. So Yiddish was my first language. And then I managed to try and lose it, which is unfortunate. But I was working in Germany and I was with a colleague and we were working in a room, and the only person in this conference center who didn't speak English was the housekeeper who was trying to throw us out of the room. And so my friend is trying to talk to her, but of course he's a New York non-Jew, doesn't know how to speak German or Yiddish. And so finally I spoke to her in Yiddish. And I told her we needed another hour, and would she just give us another hour? And my friend had no idea how we were communicating. And of course, he proceeded to tell everybody, all of the clients, that I was speaking Yiddish, which, for the moment caught me off guard, but turned out fine. But it was that same thing, because with all the German, I understood enough when things were going badly to know when to say, whoops, there's something going on here. So there are many similarities.
So one thing to add to that is, so Yiddish is roughly 70% medieval German, Middle High German, and then lots of other languages, other percentages. But the one really interesting thing is that, okay, so Yiddish is like a fusion language, just like English. English is also a fusion language. We have German and we have French and we have all these different languages in one, but we don't walk around like thinking about all those different components when we're speaking. We're not like, oh, I'm going to choose between the French word and the German word today. We don't think of it in that way, but Yiddish speakers, generally speaking, did and do, because they often had awareness of these other languages. So a Yiddish speaker can inflect their Yiddish to sound very intelligible to someone who speaks German, and they can also inflect their Yiddish to sound completely unintelligible to someone who speaks German. It's a choice that you can make. So there is a lot of overlap, but not always. So that there's lots of interesting stories and things to say about how Jews kind of use that ability to shape and change their language to deal with challenging situations with other people who maybe spoke one language that was part of Yiddish, but not the others.
Deb, can I ask a question? Shirley, sorry. Just a quick one, but I'm just curious if the Orthodox communities today is the same Yiddish that we like all knew as our parents and grandparents and what, growing up. That's
a great question. Yes and no. Yes and no. Languages evolve, right? And languages evolve in individual communities. Like, we all know that the more time you spend with people, you sometimes can develop your own like language with those people, or even in your own family, right? There are linguistic things that change in close quarters. And so in some Hasidic communities, there isn't a lot of engagement with the outside world. And in those communities, the language changes faster than it might in a different kind of scenario, because you have a community that's really only communicating with each other. But also languages change. So yes, it's the same language. Is it the same language as people spoke in 1922? Well, no, but what language is? Because all languages change and evolve dramatically over time, right? So it is the same language, but there are also a lot of differences, and there are also specific variations in different Hasidic communities. So like Satmar Hasidim don't speak exactly the same as Bobover Hasidim because they're not communities that are always interacting with each other, and their languages have developed on different streams, on slightly different streams.
Cool, thanks.
Would you just speak to, I remember early on Yiddish being referred to as the language of the ghetto, and not having words for government and war and the bigger thing, because those words were whatever the language of the country was.
So that's not exactly true. And I don't think that was ever true in Yiddish's history. But what is true is that there was always this anxiety over Yiddish within the Jewish community and outside of it. So for many generations, Jews referred to Yiddish as jargon, which basically means jargon. And there was this real sense that like Yiddish was sort of like this like dirty little crappy language compared to Hebrew and like other European languages. And then in the 19th and 20th centuries, people sort of developed these ideas of Yiddish as like that were more affirmative, and the name Yiddish kind of came into being. But I think this whole idea of the language of the ghetto, I think it just has to do with a lot of kind of internalized ideas of Yiddish maybe not being so good. There are plenty of words for war in Yiddish and plenty of words for government. And, there are some areas, there aren't a lot of words for specific plants. There's not a lot of nature terms. That's something Yiddish is a little lacking in. Words for, there are words for different kinds of trees, but not maybe as many kinds of trees as there are in the world, right? So there's, you go on a hike and Yiddish can be a little on the thin side. But in most other departments, Yiddish is very robust in terms of its vocabulary.
Certainly emotion. Charles, I see Charlie raising his hand here.
Okay, well, the old joke, what you just said, that a language is a dialect with a flag. But speaking of that, there obviously is never one unified Yiddish world. Different versions were spoke. I just wonder if the insults were different in different countries, in Poland and Lithuania and the like.
Oh, that's such a good question. Well, okay, so yes. In Eastern Europe, there were the Litvaks and the Galicianer, and maybe you know where your family came from, or maybe not. My family they used to call it a mixed marriage if a Litvak married a Galicianer, and that's in my family's dream. And they meant it very seriously. Like there was a lot of anxiety about marrying across the Litvak Galicianer line. There are all sorts of jokes and insults that Litvaks used for Galicianers, and there are all sorts of jokes and insults that Galicianers used for Litvaks or in reference to Litvaks or Litvak-like characteristics. So even in that sense, there were different streams of linguistically as well. There's something kind of funny between the Litvaks and the Galicianers. There's a linguist who drew a map about 100 years ago called the gefilte fish line. Because Litvak and Galicianer Jews didn't just speak differently with different accents, didn't just use linguistic features differently, didn't just sort of hate each other or observe holidays sometimes differently, but also ate differently. And the Jewish foods of the Jews of Galicia, and the Jewish foods of Litvaks, the Jews of the sort of northern Lithuania region, were totally different. And a linguist actually mapped out the linguistic differences in accents based on interview questions of how you eat your gefilte fish and how you eat your borscht. And it mapped out pretty much exactly. So it's not just linguistic differences, but also really vast cultural differences between Jews who lived in more of the southern Eastern Europe parts and Jews who lived more in northern Eastern European areas.
That's great. We have time for one more question, I think. Do I see any takers? If I don't see you, put it in the chat because I can't see everybody on my screen, I don't think. Anybody want to unmute? Deb, I don't see any questions. Although I would love to talk to you about your gefilte fish, but you want to Geraldine, I see you.
My mother's family was from the Carpathian Mountains of Hungary, which is now Czechoslovakia. And she was very incensed if they said she was a Litvak or a Galiciana. She would say, no, she was Ungar. Yep. And was very, very emphatic about that, about her accent and their food traditions. Even our traditions for the Pesach Seder plate are a little bit different from everyone else's.
Yeah, and there were other groups too, a lot of which people aren't as aware of anymore, like the Voliner Jews. The Jews from the Volyn region had their own dialect and their own ways of eating and their own cultural world. And, people are less, I think, aware of, because it was a smaller kind of section regionally. But yeah, that's a really good point. My parents would fight about their kugel. My mom would make kugel and my dad would be like, oh, I'm going to eat this delicious kigel. And my mom would say, it's only a kigel if you make it. If I make it, it's a kugel. So
that's something my mother would argue with also.
So on that note, Marty says Ashenen Dank. Thank you.
Which means thank you. Yep.
I just want to make a pitch. Next Tuesday night, because we have these running every Tuesday night now, we will have Wendy Sabin, who may not be quite as fun, but important in terms of how we help care for our senior citizens. Wendy is a social worker, geriatric social worker, and is going to come talk to us about the work she does, which is pretty hard around these times. So with that, Deb, there are lots of thank yous showing up in the chat. So appreciate your coming again.
Thank you guys for coming.
Maybe we'll do this in real time someday. So, yay, Deb.
Thank you, guys.
What should we say when she says we'll do it in real time so that we don't have the evil eye? What should we say?
Mir Tashem. You said someday. It will happen someday. So Mir Tashem. Yeah.
Well, I'm delighted you did it now because I would not have left the surface to come to hear you. So I got to hear you and speak with you.
Amen. Thanks, Deb. It was really interesting.
That was really Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Deb. Thanks, Charlie.
Bye, guys.
Thank you so much.
You guys have a good night.
Bye. Thank you.
Deb, did you watch Stiesel?
I don't see her.
Okay. All right. Yeah, she left. Okay. Bye, Shirley.
Bye. Good to see you